Hello everyone, I'm your host Shayanta and welcome to the show. In 1991, India opened its economy to allow foreign direct investment for the first time. Marred with burgeoning debt and depleting foreign reserves, India had to go ahead with this. And since then, India has come a long way. In this episode today, we are going to talk about India and its trade policies and how have they evolved over the years and what role did they play in shaping India's economy. We are also going to discuss India's equation with China and other countries and why exactly did India pull out of the controversial RCEP after years of negotiation. To understand India's trade policies in details and what lies ahead, we have a very special person with us. She is a doctorate in international trade and development from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, a former research officer at the Economic Policy of RBI, and is currently an assistant professor at the Madras School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Devasmita Jena.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Shayanto. It's my pleasure to talk to you and your audience. I look forward to having this discussion with you.
What we'll do is we are going to talk about a little bit about history before we delve into India's current trade policies. So, how did India's trade policies reform post the economic liberalization of 1991? Can you walk us through the major milestones that we have had for the last 2 decades?
Yeah, sure, Shayanto. If you allow me, I'll go a little bit more in the past, maybe starting from 1960s, so that I can give a brief
Sure.
context as to why and how this economic liberalization started in 1991, right? Okay. So during this period that I'm talking about, 1960s to 1990s, Indian economy was mostly autarkic, which means it was close to international trade, right? However, if you, on the contrary, if you look at the world at that time, the world trading system was gaining steam with major industrial powers like USA, Canada, etc. They were trying to get bring down trade barriers, especially in the manufacturing goods. Also, those developing countries they who sought to integrate with the world, they had benefited from this world trading system that was gaining steam. They benefited in the sense that they captured the global demand market and they propelled their growth. So countries like Chile, China, Hong Kong, to name a few, right? Now come to 1970s and 1980s. Basically, it was in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s that India felt that its restrictive policies and protectionist trade policies is not actually helping India's growth story, right? And it was also felt that because of this, Indian industry was getting more and more inefficient and technologically obsolete. So it was during this period that India, thought to go ahead with some liberalization policy. On the sidelines, again, if I may mention, during this time, the enthusiasm for multilateral process in the rest of the world was diminishing. Why? Because, as I already said, during the 1960s and 80s, world, major powers were already bringing down trade barriers. While in 1970s and 1980s, these industrial countries, which had already industrialized because they engaged in world trade in the earlier period, they felt that bilateral negotiation with like-minded countries rather than the multilateral process would result better outcomes now. So you could see the examples like NAFTA and US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, right? Now let's come to 1980s, which was your question. So Indian liberalization received the final thrust in the 1990s with liberalization reforms. Okay, so you could see that trade policy reforms such as trade tariff liberalization, rationalization of tariff structure, liberalization of imports of essential capital goods, machinery, raw material were initiated. Okay, simultaneously, export restrictions were also reduced, and there were some efforts to build up export competitiveness by increasing the industrial productivity. And towards this, steps like export credit facility, again import of capital goods, import of technology, export insurance guarantees, and market assistance schemes, etc., were undertaken by India. Now, if it is also worth mentioning that in the decade of 1980s, despite India lowered the tariff, India still remained far less open as compared to other developing and emerging market economies. So, if I could say that during this period or during this decade, other regional economy relatively enjoyed higher levels of global trade participation as compared to India. So maybe India's share remained almost less than 1% by the end of 1990s. Okay. Now, in 2000s, now let's look at this decade, which is 2000. So India, after initial hesitation and initial caution, approached regional trade agreement. So there are two reasons why India initiated this. First, as I said, by this time, most of the countries were moving away from multilateralism and they were trying to build bilateral trade with like-minded partners. So that is one reason. The second is there was stalling of Doha round of trade negotiation. So you could see that during that period, India signed trade agreements with individual trading partners as well as, plurilateral agreements with multiple partners. So, for example, India signed trade agreements with Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, Sri Lanka. Okay, and in the plurilateral case, there is ASEAN, Mercosur, and SAARC country with which India went ahead and signed a trade agreement. So this was you could say the period of liberalization for India. Now come to the period post 2008 crisis. Okay, so during this period and specifically from maybe 2011 to around 2020, we could see that India started making a switch from liberalism stance to a protectionist stance. Okay, and we could see that the customs duty during this period, especially maybe in 2014-15 till 2018-19 was very high, around 45% if I'm not wrong. Okay, and the final straw that I can say was India's pulling out of RCEP in 2019. Nonetheless, recently, starting from 2021, India is again intensifying its effort to fast track its FTA with some developed countries like United States of America, European Union, UK, Australia, and it has already signed bilateral trade agreement with the United Arab Emirates. So this is basically the snapshot of how India, proceeded with trade policy and trade liberalization.
So to talk about the many the multilateral trade deals that we have had, like India has already signed deals with, I mean, as a part of SAARC, ASEAN, and M.Sc. How far do you see they have been effective? These alliances, have they benefited India over the years, or it is mostly of a diplomatic stance that India has taken in terms of trade? How much India has benefited with these associations?
Okay, that's a very good question, Shayanto. I would say even policy makers have been deliberating over this for some time now. In fact, if you look at a couple of years back, the Indian Finance Ministry had initiated a review of India's free trade agreement. The idea was to assess whether these free trade agreements were actually beneficial to India in the sense that whether India increased its trade post signing trade agreement, whether it benefited India's growth welfare. Government also wanted to look at whether this free trade agreement are in any way undermining its efforts to boost manufacturing export. So this question is very relevant, and all the policymakers are trying to deliberate this. So if you ask me, India's trade share with the countries with which it has signed trade agreement did not rise significantly over the last decade and a half. Okay, and it it kind of remained more or less steady. Why so? If you would ask. So one reason which I can think is the preference utilization, right? Under India's preference trade agreement is quite low, which is around 25%. Some studies show this. Okay, and this low preference utilization is mostly because of lack of information by the industries on this PTAs, or maybe low margins of preference. There are also delays and administrative costs associated with the rules of origin, which is not very clear in trade agreements that India is signing. And apart from that, there are also issues of non-tariff barriers from the partner countries. So these are few reasons why India has not been able to increase its trade share with its trading partners. Another reason which I see is that India's, like I said, even if India liberalized during 1990s and it brought down its tariff structure was still higher as compared to the other developing and emerging economies, right? Like the Southeast Asian economies. So the trade agreements that India had with the Southeast Asian economies benefited more incrementally to the Southeast Asian partners rather than to India. So that is one. And simultaneously, like the trade agreement, like SARC did not take off because there was not mutual trust and security issues among the countries of the SARC, right? Now, because of all this, there is another concern among the policymakers is that because of free trade agreement, it is said that India, faced massive trade deficit. So the concern is that free trade agreement is mostly benefiting the partners and India is running a trade deficit. If you ask me, I would say that such kind of concern or fear is misplaced for two reasons. First, the trade deficits that India is talking about is not solely because of India's trade agreements. In fact, a recent study by Professor Praveen Krishna of Johns Hopkins University showed that trade deficit with India's bilateral partners accounted maybe around 12% of the overall trade deficit in 2007, and in 2007 it was lesser, around 7%, I think. Okay, so this is one. The second reason, and it is my opinion, is that you should not look at trade deficit as a measure of free trade agreement, and you should always take this measure with a pinch of salt, which I also argue in one of my paper, because trade deficit indicator only gives the performance of trade in absolute term, and it does not talk about the growth and distributional aspects of free trade agreement. Further, trade deficit also does not tell you how much a country is integrated in global value chain, which is the norm of trade these days, right? So if a country may have a massive trade deficit, but it may be more integrated in global value chain. And it is important to be integrated in global value chain because, trade economists would agree this integration helps in export competitiveness. So that's what. So yeah.
So you just mentioned about RCEP as well, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, right? And I believe India pulled out of that particular agreement because of protectionism. I mean, that was the main concern. So before we deep dive into it, can you, for our audience, explain what was exactly this RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and what was India's concern and why?
Basically, this RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a mega trade deal between high, middle, and low income countries of the Asia Pacific. So it comprises of the 10 ASEAN nations, and it also has Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and China, right? So the bloc, which accounts for about 30% of world population and 30% of world GDP, is the largest trading bloc so far. And the objective of RCEP is to basically eliminate about 90% of tariff on imports in a phased manner in coming 20 years or so. It also aims to establish a common rule for e-commerce, trade, intellectual property right. Now, India has also been in active negotiation with this group for the last 10 years or so before it plugged out of it in December 2019. I think that was your question, and your second question was about why India pulled out of it, right? What went wrong?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Like, what was India's stance with it? What was they trying to negotiate, which it didn't go through?
Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier in my earlier discussion, that India has already been started being very apprehensive of FTAs. Like, the government is initiating evaluation of FTAs, so on and so forth. So this is one reason why India pulled out of RCEP, because it gave in to the concern of massive trade deficit that it has with China and other countries of the ASEAN. Now, there are other reasons as well. Let me mention them one by one. The first is India has also been facing quite a stiff opposition from the industries and the farming community over the RCEP negotiations. For example, there was a lobby against RCEP from India's dairy industry because they feared that, if RCEP comes through, there will be a deluge of dairy imports from the New Zealand and Australia. Similarly, India's electronic and manufacturing industry was also apprehensive that that their nascent growth that they were seeing might get stymied by cheaper imports, especially from China. So they also opposed RCEP. So there was stiff lobby from the industry against RCEP. The second is RCEP negotiation failed to resolve some of India's concern over opening up of services trade and also on the rules of origin, right? And finally, I see that there was a fear that RCEP would give in to China-dominated bloc a strategic leverage over Indian economy.
Okay. So, what I believe is whenever these trade deals or trade associations are formed, they talk about removing trade barriers, right? I mean, this is not nothing something new. So, with India pulling out of RCEP, do you think India's image has taken a hit in the global trade platform, or how is what are the repercussions of it with other Indian trade partners like US or even our Australia? Will there be any effect, or do you think it's just a normal day for us?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Shayanta, I must say. So initially, I also thought that India is moving towards a protectionism sort of a trade policy, and RCEP is the pulling out of RCEP is the final blow. And I thought it would definitely have repercussions on India's image, also maybe on India's export capacity going forward. However, there is a silver lining now. Given that India is again engaging quite actively with the Indo-Pacific region, such as the India-Australia free trade negotiations. Also, India is also negotiating some free trade agreement quite actively with other countries in the West. So there is a shift for good, I would say. So India has already put out an image by doing that India now means business, and it is open to forging new trade agreements with like-minded countries, right? So this is my discussion from image point of view. Now, if I can talk from trade point of view, even if India is trying to trying to negotiate trade deals with the Western partners and some Indo-Pacific region, in my opinion, India should still pursue trade partnership with Southeast Asian nations, if not immediately with the RCEP as a bloc. Because India does share some sort of commonality with these countries in terms of culture, ethnicity, and such partnerships which has some common grounds are likely to be successful. So I also feel that Eastern Asia or Southeastern Asia is quite resilient in terms of regional value chain hub. So strategically, I feel India should consider deeper integration with this region, and it will help India import intermediate and capital goods at much more internationally competitive prices. And again, that will in turn help India's export sector, I would say.
Yes, recently we also saw that India was mulling a decision to ban all the smartphones below 12,000 from Chinese made.
Right.
So I think they are all part of the protectionism that we are talking about here. So since we're talking about RCEP, there is one more such alliance that has been doing the rounds in the international circuit, and that is the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that is being pursued by the US. So can you please tell us, similar to RCEP, why is IPEF in the news, and why is China not very happy with the IPEF that is going on right now?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, actually, IPEF is an interesting notion, I would say. And it was, as you know, was launched by United States at the Quad Summit
yes.
United States at the Quad Summit, right, in Tokyo earlier this year. Earlier this year. So the founding partners are, of course, US and other countries like Australia, ASEAN nations, and Japan, Korea, I think, and Fiji recently joined IPEF. Okay, so this IPEF, this bloc represents 40% of global economy. But unlike RCEP, so there is a difference. Unlike RCEP, IPEF is not a free trade agreement because it does not aim at liberalizing tariff rates, or it does not also aim at greater market access. So it's not a trade bloc, but it is a geopolitical alliance which is based on security interests of the members that commit to IPEF. And they basically collaborate on they will basically collaborate on issues like digital connectivity, clean energy infrastructure, anti-corruption measures, and a resilient supply chains. Now you ask me, why is China unhappy? Because the way IPEF is designed, right? IPEF, deliberately excludes China. IPEF is a conscious effort by US and its partner to reduce China's dominance in the Indo-Pacific region and
Okay.
bring down their economic reliance on China. If you look at the members of IPEF, most of the members have been mostly dependent on China for supply chain, etc. So now they want to reduce that dependence on China. So China actually went ahead and criticized the formation of IPEF, and it actually went ahead and said that IPEF is nothing but an Asian economic NATO. Yeah.
So, with IPF coming up, and US planning to revamp its influence in the Indo-Pacific region, do you think India will be affected by any chance? India is not part of IPF right now, if I am not mistaken. Do you think it has any repercussions in the Indian economy, or it is just a parallel thing that is happening that we don't need to be worried about?
No, India, we can't say that India is not a part of IPEF. Recently, India was as the last meeting that happened,
Hmm.
Uh, India considered to be an observer, but it is not that it's not a
Okay.
part of IPEF. IPEF is special because it is US led and India endorses it. That is the reason why it is special,
Okay.
because
Mhm.
both India and US have committed to IPEF despite their difference on geopolitical issues. For example, their difference on Russia-Ukraine conflict and how both the countries should deal with that. Uh, Despite of all this difference, these two countries have come together and they have committed to IPEF. So this shows that both India and US, as well as the other partners, are very keen to cooperate in the resilient Indo-Pacific objective. Right now, to understand how IPEF affects India, let's look at what IPEF entails broadly. Okay, the fact that neither US nor India are in RCEP or TPP, right? India pulled out of RCEP and US is not in TPP. So this very fact will have some bearing on the way rules and standards are going to evolve in the IPEF negotiations. And both constituencies are democratic, and they also had some reservations for free trade in the recent past, right? Now, given there is a silence on trade, like I mentioned earlier, IPEF is not a trade agreement, right? It's a geopolitical alliance,
Yes.
and it is mostly silent on trade issues and economic issues. So there has been some criticism that IPEF is not economically helpful, but it is a security heavy bloc, right? But
Okay.
the US tried to assure its critiques that even if IPEF is a security bloc, the paradigms or the pillars of IPEF is more suited to the 21st century trade deals rather than the traditional trade deals. For example, these days trade deals are more about far more than tariff cut. It entails many more things. For example, labor standards, environmental standards, so on and so forth. Okay, so in my understanding, I feel the security in IPEF comes from four pillars, that is digital connectivity, energy infrastructure, anti-corruption measures, and resilient supply chains. And this is because the pillars are interlinked to new generation areas of comparative advantage of the country, right? So basically, by safeguarding trade knowledge and operational access coming from these four pillars, what IPEF is basically doing is it is creating a enabling ecosystem that will further promote trade going forward, right? So I would say that many a times what happens is economic integration is not deepened just by reduction of trade barriers, or many a times FTAs do not generate that much trade
Yes.
that
Yes.
is expected, right? As we have seen in the case of India, right? Because there are other underlying issues like non-tariff barriers, standards, rules of origin, things like that. So I feel that going forward in current times, trade integration may deepen in response to the need for doing business with each other, or need for coming together with countries having similar standards. So collaborating on new generation rules and standards, such as domestic regulation on e-commerce, energy efficiency, environment, labor regulations, might as well help India to liberalize some of the internal restrictive regulations and enable its cross-border transactions in goods and services. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what the IPF is like. We have to see how in the coming years it translates. And also the RCEP has recently, has been ratified. I think from this year, 2022, it has come into force. So these two are the main thing. Although both are totally different. I mean, one is a trade barrier related thing, and the one is not. But let's see how India, balances it out, because it has been really tricky with all the things going on. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war, the oil prices and everything. India's stance has been very, very dicey. Well, tricky, as I say. So before we conclude today, what we would like to know is, what are the avenues of opportunities do you see for India in the next few years in terms of global trade? Is there any particular major news that we can expect in the pipeline that India might have in the next few years, or how do you see it just in the next 5 years?
Okay. I would say that, the way the global economy is today, it presents both avenues as well as challenges for India. And I would block these avenues into two broad factors. One is the China factor, and second is the services trade. So let me explain the China factor. So China is recently witnessing a slump in growth, right? So, and we know that India imports electronics, electric machineries from China, which is helpful for India in energy growth and even GVC integration. So therefore, this is a challenge for India in the sense that now India needs to look for alternative import sources, which may not be that easy. This is also again another reason why India should look east and act east. Okay, so this is the challenge. On the other hand, as we have seen, the appetite for Chinese export is reducing due to geopolitical reasons, such as US-China rivalry and Chinese support to Russian attack of Ukraine and things like that. Even foreign capital is leaving China. So countries are seeking to reduce their reliance on Chinese imports of critical goods, which is why IPEF has come into place, because they want to reduce their reliance on China. So what India could do is seize this opportunity maybe and increase its export across the world, the way other countries have been doing, for example, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and even Indonesia. Also, India is well situated geopolitically currently, right? And Western countries are looking up to India, and they are trying to build trade relationship with India. And countries are also looking to friendshore production, which means they want to shift out of China and channel their production processes into friendly countries. And India is being perceived as like-minded and friendly country by the West. So this is an avenue for India to grow its trade potential. Now, the second factor that I mentioned was services trade. As you know that, world witnessed a rise in trade in services, especially in post-2008 crisis, and COVID-19 pandemic actually enhanced the scope of services export. Now, since India has a comparative advantage in services, so it might benefit India going forward, right? So now when I say that, there are these avenues that are there for India to reap benefit from, I don't think it is going to be very automatic. So India needs to carefully put in place some trade policies to harness these opportunities. So again, how India should do that can be broken down into two broad policies. One is a focus on domestic policies, and the second is India should be negotiating the new generation deep trade agreement well. So if you look at the focus on domestic policy, by this I mean, India should invest in structural policy reforms in labor-intensive industries and try to remove the supply side bottlenecks, for example, in infrastructure, credit, energy deficit, logistics, land labor laws, etc. It should also encourage, the ease of doing business. Now, coming to the free trade agreement part. So negotiating new generation trade agreement will actually enhance gains from trade for India. For this, what India needs to do is to have a coherent approach towards free trade agreement, right? And in my view, there are three parameters that India need to consider when it negotiates trade. So India needs to look at the opportunity to expand value-added exports and look at whether FTAs expand the room for market expansion and whether free trade agreement creates scope for high-quality jobs. So these are the few things which India needs to do going forward. And your second question was about news, right? What news we are expected to see in coming times. So immediate news that we are all waiting are, India signing a trade agreement with Australia, which is already delayed for some reason, and a signing of trade deal between India and UK. And finally, I would say that I am also waiting for this India's foreign trade policy, which got delayed due to COVID pandemic. And I believe that, this foreign trade policy should be aligned with the FTA strategy that I was talking about.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. That will be all that we have for today and for the audience as well. So thank you for joining with us and giving us so many insights. I think even our audience at Australia has a lot of things to take back with its trade agreements with India, as well as its role that they are going to have in RCEP, being a part of RCEP as well. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us and giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Shayanto. Entirely my pleasure.